and instantly silenced the laughter of 50 wealthy guests. I am Katrina, 32 years old, and I had never felt such deep humiliation until that Thanksgiving night in Park City. Everything started innocently enough, as I was carefully navigating through the crowded living room with a silver tray of vintage red wine when a tipsy guest suddenly stumbled heavily into my right arm. The dark crimson liquid splashed violently all over the pristine white silk dress my sister was wearing to show off to our relatives, while I struggled to regain my balance. My sister did not hesitate for a single second before her hand flew across my face with enough force to leave a burning red mark on my cheek. She glared at me with pure venom in her eyes, while the entire room watched in stunned silence as she screamed at the top of her lungs, "Watch where you're going. Are you blind?" My mother rushed forward immediately to check on the dress without even glancing at me to see if I was injured by the collision or the assault. She grabbed my arm roughly to pull me away from her precious favorite daughter and shouted in front of everyone with a voice full of disdain, "Apologize to your sister, or get out of here." I looked toward my father for some shred of defense, but he simply walked to the heavy oak front door and held it open with a cold expression that told me I was no longer welcome. I stepped out into the freezing winter night without saying another word, because I knew this was the final crack that would shatter our family forever. But before I tell you how I made them lose everything by the next morning, please subscribe. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as my car cut through the blinding snowstorm, burying the winding mountain roads of Park City, and the physical sting on my cheek was already fading into a cold and dangerous clarity. The humiliation I felt back at the villa was quickly being replaced by a calculation that was far sharper than any grief I had ever felt before. I navigated the treacherous curves leading toward my penthouse apartment, while letting the silence of the car wash away the chaotic noise of the party I had just left behind. It was truly ironic how quickly my family had forgotten exactly who saved them from living on the streets 5 years ago when the real estate market crashed and took my father's business down with it. I remembered vividly how Dad had sat at my kitchen table with his head in his hands, while begging me to buy the villa so his wealthy friends would never know he was bankrupt. I was the one who quietly purchased the property to keep up appearances for their social circle, while Bianca was busy spending money she did not earn on vacations she could not afford. I had even foolishly agreed to fund her fashion boutique chain, because Mom insisted that Bianca just needed a little help to get started on her own feet. They seemed to believe that my generosity was an infinite resource that they could exploit forever without ever showing a shred of gratitude or basic respect in return. The elevator ride up to my floor felt agonizingly slow because my mind was already racing through the legal clauses I had written years ago for this exact scenario. I entered my dark apartment and did not even bother to turn on the lights as I walked straight to the home office where I kept my most important documents. I pushed aside the large abstract painting hanging on the north wall to reveal the hidden steel safe that contained the only leverage that mattered now. My fingers moved automatically over the keypad to enter the combination that would unlock the reality my family had conveniently chosen to ignore for half a decade. I pulled out the thick leather binder containing the property deed and the business investment contracts that I had not looked at since the day I signed them. I carried the heavy stack of papers to my desk and switched on a single lamp to illuminate the legal text that was about to destroy their comfortable lives. My finger traced the line on the property deed, which clearly stated in bold capital letters that the sole owner of the estate at 4500 Silver Creek Road was me. They were living there under a zero-rent lease agreement that gave me the absolute right to terminate their residency if they violated the Code of Conduct clause. I flipped through the pages until I found the business loan agreement for the boutiques that Bianca paraded around town as her own personal success story. Clause 14. B was explicit about the immediate repayment of the entire principal amount, plus interest if the beneficiary engaged in conduct detrimental to the investor's dignity or reputation. Tonight, she had not only insulted me, but physically assaulted me in front of 50 witnesses who could testify to her behavior. She had violated every single condition of our agreement in a matter of seconds because her temper was faster than her brain. I did not care that the digital clock on my desk showed it was past midnight when I picked up my phone to dial the number of my lawyer, Mr. Sterling. He answered on the second ring with the professional alertness of a man who was paid to handle high-stakes crises at any hour of the day. Mr. Sterling, I need to apologize for calling you this late, but we need to execute the asset recovery protocol immediately. I said into the receiver with a voice that was devoid of any daughterly affection. Is this regarding the contingency plan for the Park City estate and the retail businesses? Mr. Sterling asked calmly as I heard the rustling of papers on his end of the line. Yes, and I want everything done by the book, but with maximum speed, because I want them to wake up to a different reality tomorrow morning. I replied while staring at the signature my mother had witnessed on the loan documents. Draft the eviction notice for the villa, giving them 30 days to vacate the premises starting tomorrow. Initiate the immediate recall of all business loans provided to Bianca, and freeze the operating accounts for a forensic audit. I can have the papers served by a courier at 8 a.m. tomorrow, along with the utility cutoff orders you authorized previously. Mr. Sterling confirmed efficiently, without asking for unnecessary details about the family drama. Do it, I commanded firmly before ending the call and placing the phone face down on the mahogany desk. I turned my chair to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights twinkling below, feeling a sense of absolute finality settling in my chest. There would be no more second chances or financial bailouts for the people who had treated me like an ATM machine for years. The storm outside was raging with increasing intensity, but it was nothing compared to the legal blizzard that was about to hit my family when the sun rose. I closed the leather binder with a heavy thud, signaling the end of my patience and the beginning of their reckoning. The next morning, when the weak winter sunlight had just begun to touch the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the villa, the nightmare I had orchestrated officially began for my sleeping family. The house was usually a sanctuary of automated warmth and technological comfort that shielded them from the harsh Utah climate, but that sense of security was violently ripped away in a single second. Suddenly, the gentle hum of the geothermal underfloor heating system died out completely. The ambient, recessed lighting in the hallways flickered into darkness, and the high-speed fiber optic internet connection that connected them to the outside world was severed at the source. The multi-million-dollar smart home was instantly transformed from a luxurious palace into a freezing cold tomb of silence and isolation, as the temperature inside began to plummet rapidly to match the snowy landscape outside. The silence was broken almost immediately by the shrill and demanding voice of my sister echoing from the master suite on the second floor, where she usually spent her mornings scrolling through social media in bed. She stomped onto the landing wrapped in a silk robe, while furiously tapping the screen of her latest model smartphone, which was now useless without the Wi-Fi connection she took for granted. Mom, why is the Wi-Fi down? I can't post anything. Bianca screamed down the stairs with the petulant tone of a teenager rather than a 34-year-old woman, unaware that her mother was currently frantically pressing buttons on the dead thermostat in the hallway. Susan was too distracted by the rapidly cooling air to answer immediately, so Bianca let out a frustrated huff and switched her phone to the 4G cellular data network to complete the purchase of a designer handbag she had added to her cart the night before to soothe her wounded ego. She pressed the place order button with a smirk of anticipation, expecting the usual dopamine rush of a confirmed purchase, but instead, the screen flashed a terrifying crimson notification that froze the blood in her veins. The words, "Card declined, account frozen," stared back at her with a brutal finality that she had never experienced in her entire life of privileged dependency. She tried again with a different card and then another, but each attempt resulted in the same catastrophic message that signaled her financial lifeline had been completely severed. Down in the living room, my father was aggressively flipping the light switches up and down as if brute force could make the electricity return to the dead circuits. He marched toward his wife with a scowl etched deeply into his aging face, looking for someone to blame for the inconvenience that was interrupting his morning routine. "Susan, did you forget to pay the bills again? The whole house is freezing." Richard snapped at her with biting sarcasm, completely failing to realize that this situation was far more serious than a simple administrative oversight or a missed utility payment. Before Susan could defend herself against his accusations, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway drew their attention to the large bay window overlooking the front entrance. A sleek black sedan that looked nothing like a utility repair van had pulled up to the gate, and a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase instead of a toolbox. Richard straightened his posture and adjusted his sweater, assuming that this must be a representative from the bank or the utility company coming to apologize personally for the outage. He walked confidently to the heavy oak front door and swung it open, ready to demand an explanation and immediate restoration of services for his inconvenience. However, the man did not offer a handshake or an apology, but instead reached into his briefcase and handed my father a thick red envelope sealed with the official stamp of the district court. The process server stated my father's name to confirm his identity, and then turned around to walk back to his vehicle without saying another word, leaving Richard standing in the freezing doorway with the wind howling around him. Richard tore open the seal with trembling fingers, while Susan and Bianca gathered behind him, their breath already forming visible clouds in the rapidly dropping temperature of the foyer. They stared in collective horror at the bold black letters at the top of the document, which read, "Notice of termination of tenancy, 30 days to vacate," followed immediately by a secondary asset freezing order issued against all business accounts associated with my investment. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow, as they finally understood that the power outage was not an accident, but a deliberate act of war. All three of them scrambled to pull out their phones to call me, desperate to beg, scream, or threaten, but the only response they received was the endless, hollow ringing of a line that would never be answered again. 2 days after the first sanctions were issued against the residents of the Park City Villa, I sat at the head of the long mahogany table in the glass-walled conference room of my company headquarters. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, despite the bustle of the city outside, because I knew exactly what was coming next. I had spent the last 48 hours ignoring the hundreds of missed calls from my parents and sister, while I waited for the only information that actually mattered to me now. The large digital clock on the wall seemed to tick slower than usual as I stared at the closed door and prepared myself for the forensic reality of my family's betrayal. The heavy oak door finally opened, and my best friend and chief accountant Rachel walked in carrying a stack of financial binders that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. She did not offer me her usual warm smile or ask about my weekend, because the expression on her face was one of pure professional dread mixed with personal pity. She placed the documents in front of me with a heavy thud that echoed in the empty room and opened the first folder to a page covered in aggressive red highlighter marks. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as she flipped through the pages of bank statements that I had trusted Bianca to manage honestly for the past 3 years. Rachel pointed a manicured finger at the rows of suspicious transactions that populated the spreadsheet and looked me directly in the eyes with a grim expression. "Katrina, look at this. These aren't business expenses. 5-star resorts, gambling sites. She's bleeding the company dry." I pulled the heavy binder closer to inspect the evidence myself, feeling a cold knot of nausea forming in my stomach as I realized the absolute magnitude of the theft. Bianca had not just been mismanaging the boutiques through incompetence or laziness. She had been systematically siphoning funds through a complex web of fabricated vendor invoices. I saw recurring payments for consulting fees that went directly into offshore accounts and massive withdrawals for inventory that never actually arrived at the warehouse or appeared on the sales floor. The credit card statements painted a grotesque picture of a woman living a billionaire's lifestyle while the business she claimed to run was drowning in red ink and unpaid vendor debts. She had spent tens of thousands of dollars on designer handbags and first-class flights to Vegas, while asking me for more capital to cover unexpected market downturns during our monthly family dinners. I felt like a complete fool for believing her sob stories about the difficult retail economy when the reality was printed right here in black and red ink. But the true horror was waiting for me on the authorization pages for the quarterly budget overruns that I had been too busy to scrutinize personally. My eyes widened in disbelief as I recognized the looping, elegant signature at the bottom of the approval forms next to the official company date stamp. It was the signature of my mother Susan authorizing the transfer of emergency company reserves into Bianca's personal discretionary fund under the false pretense of urgent store renovations. My own mother had not only turned a blind eye to the theft, but had actively facilitated it by using her power of attorney to override the safety checks I had put in place. She had looked me in the face every single week and asked how work was going, knowing full well that she was helping her favorite daughter rob me blind. The betrayal cut deeper than the slap at the party because this was a calculated long-term conspiracy to exploit my trust and my resources. I threw the heavy fountain pen across the room in a sudden burst of uncontrollable rage and stared at Rachel with eyes that burned with unshed tears of fury. So my mother signed off on this? She knew Bianca was stealing from me and helped her hide it. Rachel looked down at the polished floor before sliding a final thin black folder across the table toward my trembling hands to deliver the final blow. She explained in a low, serious voice that the forensic analysis revealed cash withdrawals occurring at odd hours that matched the repayment schedules of known underground loan sharks. Bianca was not just stealing to fund a lavish lifestyle or a gambling addiction. She was stealing to keep dangerous criminals away from her door because she was in far deeper than we ever imagined. The realization settled over me like a funeral shroud because I knew that cutting off the money flow 2 days ago had just put a massive target on all of our backs. 3 days after the damning meeting with Rachel regarding the forensic accounting evidence, the silence from my family finally shattered because they had completely run out of liquid assets and patience. They decided that the best course of action was to storm the headquarters of my company to demand the restoration of their lifestyle. The first warning I received was a frantic call from the front desk receptionist informing me that a chaotic scene was unfolding in the main lobby involving 3 individuals claiming to be my relatives. I walked out onto the mezzanine balcony to witness my father Richard and my mother Susan putting on a theatrical performance for the benefit of my employees and several waiting clients. They were deliberately raising their voices to shout about elder abuse and financial abandonment, painting themselves as the innocent victims of a heartless daughter who had left them to freeze and starve without cause. I immediately instructed the head of building security to escort them out of the public eye and into the soundproof executive conference room, not to negotiate, but to contain the embarrassment they were causing. They marched into the room with a sense of entitlement, expecting a private audience where they could bully me into submission, but their confidence faltered when they saw who was waiting for them. I was seated at the head of the table, and to my right sat Mr. Sterling, who was monitoring a professional-grade audio recorder and a video camera that was already blinking with a red recording light. My parents hesitated near the doorway, but Bianca pushed past them with a wild look in her eyes that suggested she had not slept since the night of the party. She looked less like a fashion mogul and more like a cornered animal as she slammed her manicured hand onto the polished obsidian conference table with enough force to crack a nail. She did not possess a shred of the arrogance she displayed at the Thanksgiving party, replacing it with a frantic, unhinged desperation that confirmed Rachel's theory about the dangerous loan sharks. She leaned over the table, invading my personal space, and screamed at me with a voice that cracked under the weight of her terror. "Unfreeze my cards right now. Do you have any idea who is looking for me? I need that money." I did not dignify her hysterical demands with a verbal response, choosing instead to press a single button on the control panel to dim the lights and activate the main projector screen behind me. The massive display illuminated the darkened room with high-resolution scans of the falsified invoices and the unauthorized withdrawal slips that blatantly bore the company letterhead. I cycled through the slides slowly, allowing them to see the dates and amounts of the money Bianca had stolen before landing on the final slide, which displayed the document signed by my mother. The color drained from Susan's face until she looked like a ghost, and she collapsed into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support the weight of her guilt. Richard stared at the screen with his mouth slightly open, looking from the evidence to his wife, and then to his favorite daughter, finally comprehending the magnitude of the crime they had committed. The room was filled with the hum of the projector fan and the heavy breathing of three people who realized their secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows. My father tried to salvage the situation by adjusting his tie and adopting the tone of a patriarch, trying to discipline a wayward child, completely misreading the power dynamic in the room. He walked around the table to stand beside the trembling figure of my mother and looked at me with pleading eyes that tried to evoke a childhood connection that no longer existed. "Katrina, this is a family matter. We can handle this at home. Don't involve the law." Richard stammered, his voice lacking any real authority, as he gestured vaguely toward the camera Mr. Sterling was monitoring. I stood up slowly from my leather chair to signal that this unauthorized meeting was concluded and looked directly into the terrified eyes of the people who raised me. I told them clearly that embezzlement and fraud were not family matters, but felonies punishable by significant prison time under state and federal law. I delivered my final ultimatum with the cold precision of a judge passing a life sentence on a guilty defendant, without a hint of hesitation or remorse. I informed them that they had two choices: vacate the Park City estate quietly within the remaining days of the notice period, or I would hand the entire digital file on the screen over to the Economic Crimes Division of the police force before they even left the building. The three of them stood in stunned silence for a long moment before Richard grabbed Bianca's arm and pulled her toward the exit, knowing they had absolutely no bargaining chips left to play. They shuffled out of the conference room defeated and broken, leaving me alone in the dim light of the projector screen with Mr. Sterling. I watched the door close behind them and felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that the hardest part of the battle was finally over. 1 week before the 30-day eviction notice was scheduled to expire, the crushing pressure from the criminal underworld finally pushed Bianca past the point of rationality and turned her into a desperate fugitive. The atmosphere inside the freezing Park City villa had transformed from a tense family standoff into a suffocating cage of fear, because my sister knew that her time was running out much faster than the eviction clock. While my parents were consumed with the stress of packing their belongings into cardboard boxes, Bianca was paralyzed by a much more immediate and physical danger that was lurking just outside the estate gates. The breaking point arrived late in the afternoon, when Bianca received a terrifying final ultimatum on her burner phone from the loan shark she had foolishly borrowed money from to fund her gambling addiction. The message was not a vague threat, but a specific promise to break her legs if she did not come up with $50,000 in accrued interest within the next 24 hours. She spent the rest of the evening pacing around her bedroom like a trapped animal, chewing her fingernails until they bled, knowing that I had completely cut off her access to the company funds she used to rely on. She waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times in the morning, signaling that exhaustion had finally overcome my parents after another long day of arguing and packing. Bianca crept out of her room dressed in dark clothing, moving silently across the hardwood floors that creaked ominously in the silence of the unheated house. She slowly pushed open the heavy wooden door to her parents' master bedroom, holding her breath as she listened to the rhythmic snoring of the father who had always protected her and the mother who had always enabled her. She crawled on her hands and knees toward the side of the bed, where she knew my mother kept a small fireproof lockbox hidden underneath the frame for emergencies. Her hands were shaking so violently that she struggled to align the tumblers of the combination lock, which she had memorized years ago during a previous financial crisis. The lid clicked open with a soft metallic sound, revealing the neat stacks of cash that represented my parents' entire retirement savings and the velvet pouches containing the family heirloom jewelry. She stared at the diamond ring that had belonged to our grandmother, and the gold watch my father had received for 30 years of service, feeling a momentary pang of guilt piercing through her survival instinct. "I'm sorry, Mom, Dad, but I can't let them hurt me. I'll pay you back later," she muttered to herself in the darkness, trying to justify the unforgivable betrayal she was about to commit against the only people who still stood by her side. She did not hesitate any longer as she scooped every single dollar bill and every piece of jewelry into her duffel bag, leaving the metal box completely empty, except for the dust at the bottom. Bianca crept back out of the room, hurried down the stairs to the garage and threw her bag into the passenger seat of her car, before disengaging the electric garage door opener to lift it manually and silently. She reversed the car down the long driveway without turning on her headlights, until she reached the main road, speeding away into the snowy night and leaving her sleeping parents behind with absolutely nothing. The brutal reality of her departure was discovered shortly after dawn, when the pale morning light filtered through the curtains of the master bedroom to wake my mother. Susan reached under the bed to retrieve some cash for a moving truck deposit, but her scream of pure anguish shattered the silence of the house the moment she lifted the lid of the lockbox. The sound was so guttural and filled with pain that it woke my father from a deep sleep, causing him to scramble out of bed in a panic, thinking that I had sent the police to arrest them early. He found his wife collapsing onto the cold floorboards, clutching a hastily scribbled note in one hand and pointing at the empty metal box with the other, while tears streamed down her face. Susan looked up at him with eyes that were hollowed out by a heartbreak far worse than poverty, because it was caused by the person she loved most in the world. "Richard, she took everything. Bianca took our retirement fund and left. How could she do this?" Susan wailed as she shoved the piece of paper toward her husband, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. Richard snatched the note and read the selfish apology Bianca had left behind, his knees buckling, as he realized that the golden child they had sacrificed everything to protect had just robbed them of their last chance at survival. They sat together on the floor of their foreclosed home, holding each other and weeping, not for the loss of the money, but for the devastating realization that they had raised a monster who would eat them alive to save herself. The 30th day arrived exactly as the legal documents had predicted, bringing with it a biting chill that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the Park City Mountains. The deadline for the eviction notice had officially expired at midnight, and the gray morning sky hung low over the estate, like a heavy curtain signaling the final act of this tragedy. There was no room left for negotiation or delay because the law was absolute, and I had ensured that every procedural step was followed with meticulous precision to prevent any last-minute appeals. The silence of the morning was broken not by the usual sounds of a waking household, but by the heavy tires of official vehicles crunching against the frozen gravel of the driveway. The local county sheriff arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, accompanied by a private asset recovery team that I had hired to ensure the property was vacated efficiently and without damage. They moved through the grand rooms of the villa with professional indifference, checking every corner to ensure that the occupants were leaving as ordered and that the fixtures remained intact. The house that had once been filled with the noise of Bianca's parties and my mother's boasts was now echoing with the heavy footsteps of strangers enforcing a court order. My parents offered no resistance because the fight had been drained out of them the moment they discovered the empty safe box a week ago. I arrived at the scene 15 minutes later, driving my black SUV slowly toward the front gate, where the final scene of our family drama was unfolding under the gray winter sky. Richard and Susan were standing on the pavement outside the imposing iron gates, clutching a few plastic bags and worn suitcases that contained the pathetic fragments of their former life. They looked nothing like the arrogant couple who had presided over the Thanksgiving dinner just a month ago, having aged decades in the span of 30 days. My father's shoulders were slumped in defeat. His expensive coat looked too large for his shrinking frame, and my mother was shivering uncontrollably as she stared blankly at the snow. When my father recognized my car approaching the driveway, a spark of desperate hope seemed to ignite in his tired eyes, causing him to drop his bags on the wet ground. He rushed toward the vehicle before I could even bring it to a complete stop, slamming his hands against the tinted passenger window with a frantic energy that was painful to watch. He pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging up the barrier between us, and screamed words that were muffled by the soundproofing but still audible enough to understand. "Katrina, please. We have nowhere to go. Your sister robbed us? Don't do this to your parents." Richard begged, while tears streamed down his face, finally acknowledging the crime of his favorite daughter, only now that he was the one paying the price for it. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat with my hands gripping the leather steering wheel, wearing dark sunglasses that completely hid my eyes from his pleading gaze. I did not unlock the doors, nor did I lower the window to offer him the comfort or the rescue that he had expected from me for his entire life. The time for talking had passed weeks ago, when they chose to humiliate me in front of strangers, and I had no more words left to give them. I simply raised my hand to signal Mr. Sterling, who was standing near the gate with the sheriff, indicating that I wanted this interaction to end immediately. Mr. Sterling stepped forward with his usual calm authority, placing his body between my father and my car to physically sever the connection Richard was trying to reestablish. He held up a hand to stop my father's frantic pounding on the glass and spoke with a voice that was as cold and unyielding as the winter wind. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, please step away from the vehicle. You are trespassing. The shelter address is on this card." Mr. Sterling stated firmly while extending a small white card containing the details of a state-funded homeless shelter in the city. Richard stared at the card as if it were a death sentence, his hands slowly sliding off the glass of my car window as the reality of his situation finally crushed him. He stepped back toward Susan, who was sobbing quietly into her scarf, and took her arm to support her as they turned away from the home they had once pretended to own. I watched them walk slowly down the road in the rearview mirror, two small figures disappearing into the vast whiteness of the Utah winter. I pressed my foot against the accelerator and drove through the closing gates of the estate, leaving the past behind me without a single glance back at the people who had created it. The heavy iron gate swung shut with a definitive clang that resonated in my chest, marking the absolute end of the toxic cycle that had trapped me for so long. 3 months have passed since that tumultuous family storm tore through my life, and the chaotic noise of betrayal has finally been replaced by a serene and orderly silence. The winter snow has melted away from the streets of Park City to reveal the promise of spring, mirroring the profound transformation that has taken place within my own existence now that the toxicity has been purged. Justice, which once felt like a distant and impossible concept, has finally been executed with a completeness that validates every difficult decision I was forced to make during those dark days. The legal and personal battles are officially over, leaving behind a new reality where actions have tangible consequences, and bad behavior is no longer rewarded with silence or money. The final chapter of my sister's story concluded not in a luxury resort, but in the cold interrogation room of a police station near the Nevada border, where her run from the law came to an abrupt end. Bianca was apprehended by state troopers while attempting to use a crudely forged passport to cross state lines in a desperate bid to escape the loan sharks and the police simultaneously. She is currently being held without bail in the county detention center while facing a litany of serious felony charges ranging from grand larceny and embezzlement to identity theft and fraud. The golden child who once believed she was above the rules is now facing a potential sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal prison where her manipulative tears will hold absolutely no value. My parents have also been forced to confront a reality that is far removed from the country clubs and gala dinners they used to frequent during the years they lived off my generosity. Richard and Susan are currently residing in a cramped one-bedroom subsidized apartment in a rundown industrial district on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Reports from their assigned social worker indicate that their days are spent in a cycle of bitter arguments where they endlessly blame each other for failing to control Bianca or for not manipulating me effectively enough. They have lost the two things they valued most in the world, their social status and their favorite daughter, and are left with nothing but the devastating knowledge that they are the architects of their own misery. As for me, I decided that I could not return to live in the Park City villa because the walls were too saturated with memories of disrespect and ungratefulness. I sold the property for a significant profit to a tech billionaire from California and used the entire sum to expand my charitable foundation dedicated to funding female entrepreneurs. I have found a profound sense of purpose in helping women who actually possess the drive and integrity to build their own success rather than stealing it from others. My life is now filled with genuine laughter and peace, shared with true friends like Rachel who stood by me when I had nothing to offer but the truth. This story serves as a brutal but necessary reminder to everyone watching that sharing DNA with someone does not grant them a permanent license to abuse your kindness or destroy your mental health. We are often taught that family is everything, and that we must endure any amount of mistreatment for the sake of keeping the peace. But that is a dangerous lie that keeps victims trapped. True loyalty must be earned through mutual respect and reciprocal care, and it is never your obligation to set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. The most courageous thing you can do is to pick up the scissors and cut the cord that tethers you to toxic people, even if those people are the ones who gave you life. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your existence, not those who only value you for what you can provide for them. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for walking this difficult path toward justice and self-respect alongside me until the very end. I am curious to know what you think about my final decision to prosecute my sister and cut off my parents completely. Do you think I was too harsh, or would you have done exactly the same thing if you were in my shoes? Please share your honest thoughts and similar experiences in the comments section below,